You're listening to the second season of the Study Podcast with Dr. Paul Wegner on Genesis. I'm your host, Tyler Sanders, and I'm here with Dr. Paul Wegner, who's going to give us the Hebrew word of the day as we talk about the Tower of Babel.
Yeah, and as you would expect, I'm going to have that Babel here for our Hebrew word. And
yeah, you have two words highlighted here on the screen.
yeah, the first one is the name Babel. The second one is the verb to confuse.
Yeah, Balal.
And we were talking earlier about how the first one has the two base, the first two root radicals duplicated. The second one has the second two.
Yeah,
and it's common in a verb to duplicate the second two. I've never seen the first two duplicated.
Yeah.
So it seems like it's purposefully, made the first word a noun differently than how the verb took place.
Yeah. But they seem to be kind of related in a way.
And this one certainly.
Yeah.
So balal means to babble, to mix, to confuse.
Yeah.
And that word babble, I'm not sure that it's it's become an English word, but I think it's become an English word because of what we have here.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. So we have it in Genesis 11:9, and therefore the name was called Babel because there the Lord confused. So the first one is Babel, the second one is confused.
Yeah.
Okay. The languages of the whole earth. Okay.
Yeah.
This occurs 3 times in the Old Testament.
Okay.
And the first one is right before this passage. Come, let us go down there and confuse their language that they may not understand one another's speech. So that's the
setup. Yeah.
That's the one in verse 11 or 7.
7, yeah.
Then in verse 9 has the one we just talked about, and then Hosea uses that same word in 7:8, which says Ephraim mixes itself with the nations. Ephraim has become a cake, not turned.
Yeah.
The mixing of the idea, the babbling or confusing.
Yeah.
So it's the same range of meanings, but it's a totally different context.
Completely. Yeah. That's really fascinating that the word has that ability or that flexibility to go from speaking about confused language to, something this big picture of like a nation. You know, Ephraim mixing with other nations.
And remember what's happening here. They're mixing into Baal worship and all these other nations that had other gods. So this is really bad for them. But both contexts are really bad, right?
That's true. Yeah.
So
is that true necessarily just in the word itself, or are we really getting that mainly from the context?
Probably from the context.
Okay.
Yeah. The word of itself means
it
to
really
mix.
is just a mixing kind of thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's fascinating.
Okay. Now there's one other thing you wanted to mention.
Oh, I did. In Genesis 11:7, we have the word us, come let us go down, which I think we've talked about in previous episodes, probably in the very first 2 or 3 episodes same thing. We have like this kind of plural.
Yep.
But who are we talking about?
And it's a real difficult concept.
Yeah.
I've actually argued that it's the plural. It's a plural of talking about the plural of the Godhead.
Yeah, the heavenly court.
Heavenly court kind of thing.
Yeah.
There's multiple things, but the one that I think makes the most sense is that the angels are coming down with him to see what they were doing.
Conceptually, at this point, they were thinking of God as one.
Yes. Yeah. And then when it says, come, let us go down there and confuse their language, it's also kind of funny because in that passage in chapter 11, they're trying to build this tower that's reaching up into heaven, and God has to come down to even see it. It sounds like, so I think it's like a joke.
Yeah, that's true. That's good.
All right. Now, this is kind of interesting. We've got the table of nations in chapter 10.
Okay.
And which is pretty much divided between Japheth's line, then we have Ham's line, and then we have Seth.
Yeah.
And it's real clear. They're divided up. And at the end of each one of them, it actually mentions, here, let me show you. It actually mentions that from these, the coastlands of the nations were separated into lands, everyone according to his language. And then after Ham's, it says very same, according to their languages. And after Shem's, it says that.
So we're getting the genealogies. And then each genealogy ends with some kind of statement that, like, and this group of people went to their own place, spoke their own way, kind of did their own thing.
Yeah. What's interesting is we haven't got to chapter 11 yet, which means at chapter 11 they're going to babble God's going to babble the languages.
He's going to confuse the languages.
So it sounds like what's happened is that or the author wanted to make sure that these genealogies were contained and kept in there.
Yeah.
And then it is going to go back and put chapter 11, which talks about the Tower of Babel, where God confuses the languages and sends them out.
So is 11 then functioning as an explanation of that? Those three statements in 10 of like, you have these three genealogies and these three lines go their separate ways kind of.
Yeah.
And the Tower of Babel is kind of an explanation of how that happened, maybe?
Yeah, probably.
Okay.
What I'd actually argue also, it's out of chronological order. So the Tower of Babel probably happens sometime in chronology during the time of those genealogies. Yeah, and it didn't want to break them up to put that story in.
Okay.
Yeah, so I thought that was interesting.
That is very interesting, yeah.
Now, let me just go back. I wanted to talk about this line of
Shem's line, yeah.
It's really interesting. So it's got our Pod, then Shelah, Eber, and then you've got Peleg. And at Peleg, this time we're in chapter 10, we're going to go down to Joktan, and it goes down to basically the family line and then just stops.
Yeah.
When we get to chapter 11, it has the same people, gets to Peleg, and now it goes through another line of that, of another son, and now we're going to do Ru, and it's going to get us down to Terah and then to Abraham.
Yeah.
So I think it's really interesting. You can see that it means there's a division here.
Yeah.
The one side is not going to be the chosen one. This next one is.
Yeah.
And I think that's interesting. And I think Peleg even means to divide.
Yeah.
Because it'll say, and I think it's in verse 25. It says, and at this point, there was the world was divided or something like that. And it doesn't really explain what it means.
Yeah.
But if you see this, it might mean that here's the one line going in one direction, but this is the line God's going to follow.
Yeah.
So maybe it's getting that even.
It's pretty fascinating.
Yeah.
And it's interesting to see, that this is where, I think obviously when you read the rest of Genesis, Abram's the most important, next step.
In God's plan kind of thing. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so in Genesis, here's where it is. Genesis 10:32 says, "These are the families of the sons of Noah, according to their genealogies, by their nations. Out of these, the nations were separated on the earth after the flood." So there's that word, separated.
Oh, yeah.
Peleg. So I thought, that's interesting. It doesn't really tell you what it means, but it showed you almost up earlier, I think. Yeah. Then we got Genesis 11. So now we're at the Tower of Babel. So Genesis 11:1, now the whole earth used the same language and the same words, and it came about as they journeyed east that they found a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. And they said to one another, "Come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly." And they used bricks for stone, and they used tar for mortar. All of those fit really well. Well, let's read the next one. Then I want to show you some things.
So verse 4.
Yeah, and they said, "Come, let us build for ourselves a city and a tower whose top will reach into heaven. And let us make for ourselves a name, lest we be scattered abroad over the surface or over the face of the whole earth."
That's interesting. Little setup right there.
Yeah.
We need a name or else we're going to be scattered.
Yep. And let me read just a little more. And the Lord came down to see this city. And remember, we talked about that almost being like a joke.
Right.
Because, they wanted to make a tower so big. Yeah. And the tower which the sons of men had built. And the Lord said, "Behold, they are one people, and all have the same language." And this is what they began to do. And so nothing will be, which they purpose to do, will be impossible for them. If you think about it, that's quite a statement.
Yeah.
So God has to, it'd be great if they did all good things and so that they did some amazingly good things. But they're going to also do really bad things. And so God has to separate them. "Come now, let us go down there and confuse their language that they may not understand one another's speech." I don't know if you've ever been in a foreign country, and when you
have,
and when you hear them talking another language, I remember we were in Paris one time, and it felt like they were talking about you.
Sure, right.
You never know what they're saying, but you're always wondering, well, what are they saying? Are they talking about the Americans that are there?
Right.
Anyway, so verse 8, "And the Lord scattered them abroad over the surface of the whole earth, and they stopped building the city." So it actually worked just like God had planned. Okay? Therefore, its name was called Babel because there the Lord confused the language of the whole earth. And from there, the Lord scattered them abroad over the surface of the whole earth.
Yeah, just what they wanted not to happen.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, so once again, God steps into history to restrict sin, and I think that's what this whole chapter is about.
Yeah.
And I assume that means, this is the second time he stepped in for the flood, then he stepped in here.
Sure, yeah.
So I'm thinking, man, it seems really important for him to get Abraham here, and I think that must be what's going on. He's got to keep him at least somewhat not wicked to bring his people in here
until we get to Abraham and a covenant and kind of move forward.
So it seems kind of interesting.
Huh.
Okay, but the latter part of the chapter indicates that God's going to use Shem's line through Peleg to bring about Abraham, to whom he's going to bring the deliverance to mankind. So it's kind of interesting how the plan goes. Things like. Okay, the Tower of Babel is located in the land of Shinar. So I've got a picture of here where Shinar is. And Shinar is kind of it says they traveled to the east. But if you look, it's actually more southeast. But that's probably close enough for them.
Yeah.
It says they made bricks and pitch, for which they both of those are plentiful in Babylon. Notice it doesn't say stones, because that's usually what they built with.
Sure, yeah.
But in the Mesopotamian Valley, there are no stones.
It's all kind of mud.
Yeah.
Make bricks.
So they're using the very things that they've got.
Yeah.
Their understanding of the heavens would allow them to think that they could actually get up, talk to the gods. Let me show you this. See, this is kind of a picture of what they think it is.
Yeah.
They've got heaven up there on top where the
kind
gods
of on a
are.
dome almost.
Yeah, that firmament, and they even use that word. Firmament is, I think we've talked about this, is the idea of a hard surface.
Yeah.
But it's more how it functions and how it is formed.
Yeah.
Yeah, we talked about it. All right, so they think it's a hard thing holding up the heavens. And then you can see the mountains. The mountains are probably what holds the firmament up. And then we got the earth there. And then we've got what are called the foundations of the earth. So they actually understood that there would be probably rock formations that would hold the earth up.
Interesting.
And then Sheol is a place underneath, usually they consider it. And then we know that they talk about the waters under the earth so that they know that there's some kind of water there, a watery mass too.
Interesting.
Yeah. So if they have this concept of heaven, I wanted to see this one in Malachi. Bring me the whole tithe into the storehouse so that there may be food in my house. And test me and know this, says the Lord of hosts, if I will not open for you the windows of heaven. So that idea of windows of heaven, that would make sense if they understood this firmament is hard with windows in it.
Right.
Other places talk about opening the windows so that the hail and snow can come down.
Yeah.
So it makes sense in their understanding.
Yeah, I mean, and why they would ask for rain from a god that lives above them.
Yeah.
Like they would have control of that.
Yeah. Okay. So I thought that would be helpful. Now, Babel in Babylonian means gate of God.
That's interesting.
Yeah, it doesn't mean to babble at all. So it's something very positive in Babylonian. It's something in the biblical text that's very bad.
Right.
But in Genesis 11:9, it says it came in what we call popular etymology to mean to confuse or babble the languages. And I'm thinking what that means is almost our word babble probably has come from this biblical passage.
Yeah.
And we've build our English language around that.
So strange. It's amazing how that happens.
Yeah.
And how things kind of shift and stuff. I mean, I would almost, it's probably not quite as clear, but I feel like we probably see that even in like the word Samaritan.
Oh, maybe.
Like in English, when you say a good Samaritan, you don't really think of a person from Samaria.
That's
it means someone who's like, does something good that like you haven't earned. Someone just helps you with something or whatever.
But think about that's almost for sure where that came from is the biblical passage that means that.
Right.
Yeah. The tower was probably a ziggurat, which is a multi-storied tower with a temple on top.
I believe that term came up when we talked about the flood.
It probably did,
right?
Yeah.
Wasn't that another one of the ideas of
what the
an
ark could have been
essentially?
shaped like?
Yeah. Not the biblical ark, but the ark from the story of the boat from which culture would that have been? Was it Babylonian?
Sumerian, probably
Sumerian.
even before that. Yeah. Anyway, there's an interesting story from the ancient Near East where Babylon was built, and it contained a tower that reached into the Apsu, which would be heavens. So so it is interesting.
Yeah.
There's actually a tower or a ziggurat in Babylon, and this is pretty much what it looks like today.
Wow.
Yeah. So it would make sense for them to have something like a temple up on top, so they could communicate with the gods, and maybe even have a place where the gods could come and talk to them.
Sure. Yeah.
So it would make sense. Oh, this is what it looks like today. It started off.
It's still very.
Let me show you. See, that's what they started to rebuild it, and so that's what it looked like then. Now it looks like this.
Oh, this is a reconstruction.
Yeah, they've actually started rebuilding it.
Interesting.
Yeah,
Wow.
I don't know if I think they probably stopped now, but there for a while, Iran was doing a lot of reconstructing things.
That's very interesting. This is on the historical site. This is a reconstruction on the historical site.
Yeah.
That is very fascinating.
Yep. All right. They thought that they could reach into heaven, and God says that he has to come down to see the small thing that they're making. So I think that's funny. They separated by the language, which should have the natural effect of causing them to not trust each other. And so it worked perfectly from what God was thinking. So God's plan worked.
Yeah.
Okay, now we're going from Shem's line. We're working our way through. See, we got to Peleg, and now we're at Ru, and now we're working our way down to Abraham.
Yeah.
Remember I told you that Abraham was not the oldest son?
Yeah.
And yet he's the first son here.
Right.
We can do that because we know when Terah died. He died at 205. We also know Abraham's age when he came out of Haran. He was 75. And Terah dies in Haran. So we know it's very close to that time.
Yeah.
That means there's 130 years between the children. And Terah started having children when he was, I took the 30, there's 70 years from the 205 to the, and then minus the 75. So he's got 130 years.
Yeah.
So that means that he started having children when he's about 70.
Yeah.
So, and so we know that Abraham wasn't the first one.
Yeah. Now, this is kind of interesting. I maybe you could tell me a little bit more about this, because I think the assumption is firstborn son always, right?
Yeah.
But it seems like in Genesis that's not happening.
It often
There's
doesn't
a lot
happen,
of problems with the first son, or like something goes awry, and so there's this. What's happening with that? Do you know why that's happening?
I think this is actually before you get to the biblical passages that talk about the firstborn son. So I wonder if this is preceding that. Though I think there
so it
was
wouldn't have maybe been a value or something.
I think there was probably always. I think it's kind of natural for your first son to be thought of as the most important and stuff like that, or who will carry on your line and stuff like that.
I mean, cross-culturally, that seems pretty true in a lot of ways.
So I think what happened is it was probably a common understanding before this, but it's not till the biblical text where you start actually getting that codified almost.
Yeah.
Where then at that point you've got a son that gets 2/3 of the inheritance, the blessing and stuff.
Yeah.
So I think that becomes later after this probably.
I just always thought that's fascinating in Genesis.
Yeah.
It doesn't go the way you think it's going to go.
Yeah.
And
that's probably important because God's choosing all the way through.
Yeah.
So you've got Esau and Jacob.
Yeah, that's a big one. Yeah.
So I think that's what's happening.
Yeah. Okay.
All right. Okay. So now we've got that.
Abraham's not the oldest, but he's very important.
So here's our conclusions.
Yeah.
Genesis 10 and 11 appear to be out of chronological order. And I think that makes sense because you've got that genealogy you want to keep together. Then you've got the story of how the language is divided. So I think that actually makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Then.
I mean, is it possible that it's happening inside some point in that genealogy, essentially?
Oh, yeah. I think
that's kind
so.
of what it's.
Yeah. So during the time of
from the beginning to the end of that genealogy.
Yeah. Sometime in there it was happening.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's totally logical.
Then the tower appears to be a ziggurat because that's what they would have understood, and it makes sense to them.
And that would have been built of bricks.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which fits the context really well because they would have had mud bricks. They wouldn't have had stone and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And then God appears to have appeared to curtail sin a second time.
Yeah.
I think that's really interesting. We haven't got to Abraham yet where he's going to choose a line.
Yeah.
But we need to have God continue to keep it curtailed.
It's interesting because I feel like it's a little more explicit in the flood story.
Yeah.
Of things are really bad. It's a little more implicit in this one, I think. There's like a sense of men can kind of accomplish anything.
Yeah.
And like there's hints, but it doesn't seem like God just comes out and says like, and that was bad or that was sin or whatever. But his response seems to indicate that was a problem, right?
And by them thinking that they could go up to heaven and I actually think that was probably a lot more devious than what we think. Because if they were going to go up to heaven, then they could get gods to communicate with them, and then they could control history.
Right,
so I'm assuming that it's a lot more devious than we would think. And so that's why it's probably put in the same category as the flood.
Yeah.
Okay. The genealogies lead down to Abraham.
Yep.
And that makes it pretty clear.
Yeah.
It appears that they think that they can get into heaven to manipulate the gods. I think that's what they think they can do.
Yeah, that's the big problem.
Yeah. And then God handles the situation very well. Mankind did exactly as God had planned. By changing their languages, that would be normal that they would then separate and not trust each other. And so it would certainly slow down any development that would have happened in both positive and negative things.
Now, do you think that's kind of what mankind was? Is it verse 4, I think, where it says like, we need a name so we can stay together.
Yeah.
Is it so that they can get more done? There's kind of a recognition there of like, we can accomplish all these things that we put our mind to or whatever.
It might be. But I think it's even there. It's probably a little more devious, because if they can get up into heaven and get the gods on their side, then they could actually get, they'd be so powerful.
Because we see that they want to, mankind wants to stay.
Together. Yeah.
Okay.
And that makes sense.
Yeah.
Oh, I think that's it.
That's it.
Yeah.
Great passage.
It is very interesting things in it.
Yeah. It's kind of a strange passage in a lot of ways, but I think there's a lot of very interesting things in there that you brought out.
I think if we understand also that God is a second time slowing down sin, that tells me he's a very gracious God, that twice now he stepped into history to curtail their uncontrolled wickedness.
Right.
And it seems amazing to me.
And I think that's an important thing you brought out, was that we need to see this kind of in light of the flood.
Yeah.
And how God steps in. It's probably useful to see how it's different from other ancient Near East stories of how gods would step in and stuff like that, to see how different the God is,
Right.
But great passage, super interesting.
Yeah.
So what's our next topic? We're going to get into Abraham?
I think Abraham.
Yeah. Okay.
That's probably the covenant, because that's going to be a real important development from then on.
Okay. That sounds good. Well, thank you so much for your time. And next week we'll get into the covenant.
Okay. Sounds good. Bye-bye.